Hey everybody, thank you for joining me again as we continue our survey on Hebrews chapter 11. We've been taking a look at the life of Moses and some of the highlights of what happened to him and the children of Israel. In Psalm 78, Asaph, the psalmist, writes, "He struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the firstfruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. Then he led out his people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them in safety so that they were not afraid." And we'll look at more of that psalm a little bit later on as Asaph reminds the children of Israel that their God has always been with them, has always protected them, has always done what's best for them. Let's go ahead and take a few moments to pray to the same God that watched over Israel, the same God that watches over us. God in heaven, we do thank you for your might, for your power, your strength, the fact that you always watch over us, that you always do what's best for us. Lord, help us to have the courage to obey you, the courage to follow your plan for our lives. And Lord, thank you for just guiding us individually, as a church, as a nation. We pray for wisdom for our leaders. We pray for healing for our country. And Lord, we pray that we would turn to you, that we would seek refuge in you, just as the Israelites did. God, we just thank you for the time that we have today to look at this portion of your word. We love you and praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. So as we continue in our study, we're going to kind of go back to last week and looking at the 10 plagues. Now, real quickly, plague number 1 was the water turning into blood. We had the plague of frogs, gnats, flies, livestock, the plague of boils, the plague of hail, locust, the plague of darkness, and then the culmination of the plagues was the death of the firstborn. Now, the psalmist, as I mentioned earlier, Asaph, he has to remind Israel, and Israel had to be reminded often, just as we do, that God was God and that he had taken care of them in the past, so why would he not take care of them in the present and in the future? So we'll read part of Psalm 78 because it gives us a review of the plagues in their time in Egypt, starting in verse 40. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. They tested God again and again and provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power or the day when he redeemed them from the foe, when he performed his signs in Egypt and his marvels in the fields of Zoan. He turned their rivers to blood so that they could not drink of their streams. He sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them and frogs which destroyed them. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the firstfruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. Then he led out his people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them in safety so that they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And he brought them to his holy land, to the mountain which his right hand had won. He drove out nations before them. He apportioned them for a possession and settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. Yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies. So we see that overview. It doesn't mention all of the plagues, but here we can see the 10 plagues listed that we looked at over the last 2 weeks. And one thing that I wanted to add that I neglected to mention last week was who God had carry out each of the plagues. And I don't know that I can come to any conclusions, and I couldn't find any commentaries that talked about this very much, but it's interesting that the first 3 plagues, it's Aaron that raises his staff and is used by God to institute these plagues, if you will. And so we see with the blood, with the frogs and the gnats, that it's Aaron that God uses. The next 2, we see the Lord himself proclaim these, and we don't see any mention of Aaron or Moses involved directly in implementing those plagues. Then the next four, plagues 6, 7, 8, and 9, Moses is the one who's instructed to raise his staff or to raise his hand in some cases, like with darkness. And then the final plague, the final judgment, if you will, upon the Egyptians is the death of the firstborn. And I do find this one interesting that it's the Lord who takes this one on. And I think maybe it's God reminding Moses, reminding the Israelites, and reminding the Egyptians that he is God and God alone, and that he is the only one who gives life, and he's the only one who can take it back, because life belongs to no one except for God. We just mentioned, I believe last week, Deuteronomy 32:39. I am the Lord your God, I give life, I take it away, I wound, I heal. And so we are reminded, as Israel was, that God is the giver of life, and it is only his to take. Now, I gotta say, I received more questions on the last couple of weeks on those messages than I have on any message in a long time, and I found it intriguing, and the nerd in me wanted to dig into this some more. So there were several questions from a few different individuals about the plagues, and so I thought we'll cover those. And there's four main, really three categories. First of all is the timeline. How long did the plagues last, individually and collectively? And does it matter if we know how long they lasted? The next two are kind of related, livestock and crops. It seems on the surface that some of the verses, some of the plagues contradict the others. There seems to be some incongruity between them, and so we'll take a look at that. And then kind of a general category, which we won't spend a lot of time on today because that'll be coming up later, but evidence for the plague outside of the Bible. So let's take a look at the timeline. Now, how long did the plagues last? I don't know why, but I think as a kid I just thought, well, there's 10 plagues, probably 10 days, you know. I wasn't really studying scripture at that point. But in my research, and I looked at a lot of different opinions on this, a lot of different commentaries, I saw anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 years. Now, I would say it's pretty safe to throw the high and the low out. So the 3 years, nah, probably not. Very unlikely. And the 3 weeks, probably not likely as well. This particular timeline that you see here, this individual says that they lasted 104 days, so a little over 3 months, and he makes some pretty compelling arguments as to why he thinks it lasted that long. But let's take a look at the scriptures and see what clues we get, because the scriptures don't give us a lot. In fact, there's only 3 plagues that give us where we're given a definite time frame. The first one is the most obvious and the easiest, and that is the plague of blood. Once the water is turned into blood, scripture is very clear in Exodus 7:25 that it lasted for 7 days, for a week. So that one we know for sure. Now we get a little bit of an indication. That's what I put in that far right column. If there's a clue in scripture that kind of gives us an idea of how long it may have lasted, I put it in there, but you can see most of the plagues we don't have any clues within the Exodus narrative there. The plague of frogs, the only thing that we get, the only clue is that they came upon the land, they covered the land, and then they died and they began to stink. And that's in Exodus 8:14. And so because they started to smell, we have an idea that that took time. So it wasn't probably a one-day thing. It was going to take a little bit of time for those frogs to die, to begin to decompose. They're going to be rotting out in the Egyptian sun. And that's where gnats or mosquitoes or any other nasty little creature may have nested and incubated and then hatched. And so gnats, we have no indication as to how long they lasted. Same thing with the flies, although in chapter 8, verse 24, it does talk about the flies ruined the land. It just gives us the idea that it took time. Now, we don't know how long it took because we don't know exactly what these flies were. Most scholars believe they were some sort of biting fly, Some say they were mosquitoes, some say the gnats in Plague 4 were mosquitoes. We don't know for sure, we just know that they were an annoyance, and at least with the flies it said that they ruined the land. Now, livestock, boils, and hail, we have no real indication as to how long those plagues lasted. But you can imagine the plagues, they would have had to have lasted long enough to be not just an irritant, but a motivator for Pharaoh and the Egyptians to turn to the Lord, which of course Pharaoh did not. Now, in the locusts, we can guess that there were at least 2 or 3 days that the locusts lasted. The scriptures do give us some indication in chapter 10, verses 13 and 19. Verse 13, we read that the locusts came in with an east wind, and it took a day. It talks about day and night. So we're looking at about a 24-hour period of time. And then, of course, we can assume it took around that long, maybe, for the locusts to disappear, because in verse 19 it says that God sent a west wind and drove every last locust that was in the land of Egypt into the Red Sea. So we're looking at a few days with the locust. Now, darkness, we do get a specific time measurement in verses 21 through 23 of chapter 10, and that's 3 days. And with the firstborn, we know that it started around midnight, and we can assume that it went through the night based on what those passages say in chapter 12, verse 29 through 31. Now, I put a little comment to remind me, it says that's March and April is the abbreviation there, because we do kind of have an indication as to when the plagues ended, even if we don't know exactly when they started, and that helps us with the time frame. Because if you recall, that gap between chapter 10 and chapter 12 is where the Passover was implemented. And so we know that the Passover would have been at the end of March or the early part of April. So that gives us an indication as to when the plagues ended. Now, Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones, in his chronology, and I saw a few folks that agreed with his chronology, he says that it lasted 40 days. And part of his argument is that you see the number 40 appearing frequently in Scripture and often associated with discipline. So, for example, the children of Israel wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. So 40 days would make sense, and I don't know exactly how he came to his conclusions. By the way, I'll hold it up here. Here's the chronology of the Old Testament by him. It is from Master Books. And in his chronology, he says, as you can see there, he starts day 1 with the staff being changed into the serpent. And so starting on day 1, and then day 2 is when the blood happens. We know that lasts for 7 days. But then there's time for conversation between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh. And so he has the frogs starting on day 10, gnats on day 13, flies on day 15, livestock on day 18, boils on day 20, hail on day 22, locust on day 25, and darkness on day 27. Now, the reason there's a gap between darkness and the firstborn, again, is because of the Passover and the time that would have taken to carry that out and to obey the Lord. And so he puts not just a guesstimate, but he puts a specific date that the plagues ended on the month of Nisan, the 15th day of 1491 BC. So he gets very specific. And the 40 days does make sense, and he's basing that on, for example, when some of the crops would have been destroyed, and we'll hit on those in, I was just going to say in a moment, we're going to hit on those now. So how do we know when we have an idea of when those crops may have been destroyed? So we know that the flies ruin the land in Plague 4. And then we see in the livestock the fact that they are affected in the field by the plague, by some type of disease. And so here's the second category of questions. It has to do with the food supply, if you will. So the animals that they would have had, and then the plants, the vegetation, fruit trees, things of that nature. And so when you go through those passages, it talks about the livestock. In fact, I'm going to grab my Bible here. And this is a pretty awesome Bible that I like using. This is the Archaeology Study Bible. It's in the English Standard Version. But when it talks about, so for example, the livestock, we'll go ahead and read in chapter 9. Said, the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, behold, the hand of the Lord will fall with a very severe plague upon your livestock that are in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. And it said the Lord made a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt. So, first thing to point out is that the Bible is very specific as to what livestock means. It's not just cows, it's not just sheep, but it's pretty much everything on 4 feet. So it's horses, donkeys, camels, herds, flocks. Those are the words that the Bible uses. Now, herds and flocks, that would include cattle, goats, sheep, anything along those lines. And so the key phrase there is in the field. And so I don't know for sure, but it kind of gives the idea that maybe, now the warning's not included there like it is later on, but it seems like maybe a warning was given that, look, if you leave them out in the field, they're going to be affected by this plague, but if you bring them inside, if you shelter them, they won't be. And so that would mean they'd still have some animals left. Because the question that came up from a few folks was, well, wait a minute, if all of the livestock died in Plague 5, then how could there be any left to die later on? So, for example, in the death of the firstborn, it said the firstborn of the livestock would die as well. So there wouldn't be any left. Now, another possibility is that maybe the Egyptians, after their livestock are killed, let's assume they were all killed in Plague 5, maybe they went over to the Israelites and stole their animals. Not sure. Or stole animals from another source. I don't know. But it's kind of interesting to look at these details and think about God's amazing power and how clear he is when he is giving the Egyptians warnings here. Now, man and beast are both affected by the boils in Plague 6. Now, whether anyone dies from that, I don't know, but so then we get to the hail, and this is where we get the passage in 9:25, similar to what we saw in verse 3. So in 9:25 it says, the hail struck down everything that was in the field in all the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and the hail struck down every plant of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were, was there no hail. So now there is a warning that is given earlier in verse 19, where they are told, hey, get your servants and have them bring all of the animals, all of the livestock indoors, and they will be protected. So we know that happened. So I guess the implication is, as we said before, either they were spared in Plague 5 because they had also brought them inside, or they stole some from the Israelites. And I didn't find any conclusive agreement on what exactly happened in that case. And similarly with the plants and the trees, because we know that they are affected probably by the flies in Plague 4. They're affected by the hail. So what's left for the locust? Well, of course, the hail, which was massive, and we're talking lightning strikes, fire and hail as well, utterly throwing everything, or destroying everything. But you can imagine if you had some sort of fruit tree that, although the hail would have pummeled the vines and smashed even the fruit, you could go out maybe the next day after the hail stopped and gather some of the fruit. Whatever was left, anything that was edible and a few things that weren't edible, the locusts just decimated. So how did the Egyptians survive? How did they continue? Well, they probably had kept the practice of up from their time with Joseph from way before. They probably still were storing grain, maybe, and so they had grain to eat. But you can imagine that they were in very dire straits because the majority of their food sources were gone. Remember, their fish was gone too, because the fish in the Nile had been killed in the first plague. And I don't know if they ate frogs or not. Probably not, because they worshipped them, but they wouldn't be eating frog legs. That wouldn't be on the menu either. So, I'm trying to remember. There's one other thing I was going to say about the food, and I'm forgetting it, but it'll pop into my head later, maybe. So, evidence of the plagues. Now, it's interesting. I did read one quote that said there's no historical evidence that the events of the book of Exodus even happened. It's not history. It's just mythology. But we believe in God. We believe in the God of the Bible. And if God's word, if the Bible is God's word, and we believe it is, then it's true. What he says is reliable. Time magazine last year reprinted an article from a year before, and the headline was, "Did the 10 plagues of Egypt really happen?" Well, to me, the article would be one word: yes. But that would make for a very compelling article, I guess, if you don't believe in God. So they came up with 3 possible explanations as to the plagues and how they could have happened. So they're not accepting the biblical account, but they talked about different scientists and experts that had these theories. The first one was a massive volcanic eruption. Part of the problem with that theory is that the volcano they're referring to erupted in the early 1200s BC, and that doesn't really fit with the timeline of the Exodus. Now, we're not sure whether the Exodus happened in the 15th century or it could have happened in the 13th century, but in any event, Time magazine, their article said that these plagues were caused by a volcanic eruption. Now, if you're from Washington State, you remember when and you're old enough, you remember when Mount St. Helens erupted. It did have an effect on weather, and of course when the eruption was occurring, if you were living in Yakima and it was 12 o'clock noon, you couldn't see anything. Street lamps were coming on because they thought it was night. It was dark. It had an effect on crops. In fact, if I recall, the apple crops the following season were some of the best ever because of the ash. Now, in this particular volcanic eruption, what they're saying happened is that this volcano erupted debris and ash that was very caustic and acidic, caused acid rain, and so they can explain away all of these plagues because one of the chemicals that would have been spewed from this volcano would have landed in the Nile River and would have turned it a reddish brown. It's like, okay. And because it was poisoning the river, then plague 2, the frogs would have found it, incompatible with living, and so they would have jumped out of the river, and the continued acid rain would have killed the frogs, and that's what would have spawned the mosquitoes and the flies, and would have caused problems on the cattle, killing them, and boils on people, again from the acid rain. And so they go through and explain away every plague based on the volcano. And the hardest one for them to explain away is the last one, the plague of the firstborn. But they say, you know what, the Egyptians probably would have sacrificed their own firstborn just to appease one or many of their gods, which is possible. They certainly had that mentality. The other explanation is red algae, which is ironic because we're going to talk about red algae in a little bit here. But kind of a thing where the red algae would have formed in the Nile River because of the river having been warmed and this ties in with their third explanation, climate change, in that the Nile would have been warm, it would have slowed down, this red algae would have formed, and it would have poisoned the river, causing the frogs to jump out, and, you know, similar to our first one. So those are the three arguments. On the email that is included, that includes the link to this YouTube video, I will actually include a link to that Time Magazine article. If you don't get our emails, you know, you can email me at dek317@comcast.net. Again, that's dek317@comcast.net, and I'll add you to the email list so that you can get that link. Now, I do like this quote that was included by Rabbi Yonatan Nero. He said, "To me, it doesn't matter whether scientists are able to find a historic basis for something that happened around 3,500 years ago. The central message is that God brought the plagues on Egypt in order to free the Israelite slaves." And so I agree with him, although I think it kind of misses the fuller point, in that God was proving that he was indeed God to the Egyptians, and he was proving to the Israelites that he was not only powerful, but he was worthy of their trust. So I would just say that the quote needs a little more fleshing out. Now, one thing I wanted to mention too about the plagues is that you know, we mentioned several gods, and I mentioned last week that there were over 2,000 deities that the Egyptians worshipped, and really the plagues were polemic in that they were a kind of a declaration of war on the gods by the God of the universe. And so one of the goddesses that I did not mention, and I had not read about her, but I read it in the Archaeology Study Bible, and was Mayat. And Mayat was the daughter of Ra, or Re, the sun god, and she was the goddess of truth, justice, wisdom, the stars, law, morality, order, harmony, the seasons, and cosmic balance. And so think about this. All of those plagues were about chaos and disruption and disorder, and they all were a slam against her and the other gods. But what I didn't know is that Maat is not only a goddess of the Egyptians, but a way of life. It's a philosophy. In fact, you can find websites, I did find them, that talk about anywhere from the 7 to the 49 principles of Maat. And they all have to do with being people of truth, justice, wisdom, law, order, harmony, and cosmic balance. And so 3 of the main ideas of Maat, this, and the Egyptians, by the way, believed that this philosophy, this way of life, was instituted at the creation of all things. And so it was an organizing quality of the cosmos, of the universe. And so that's one of the reasons that as a culture, the Egyptians were very orderly. We mentioned before that they wouldn't have had to have dealt with pandemics, probably the way we are dealing right now, because they were very clean people. They were a little OCD, and we see that even in their death rituals and how they would mummify the pharaohs. And so they were very clean, very neat, very organized, very orderly, and that was part of their DNA in a sense. And this philosophy of Maat was the antithesis of chaos. Everything had a purpose, everything had an order to it. And here's the kicker, is we mentioned last week that the Egyptians viewed Pharaoh as a deity, that he was a god. The Pharaoh's main responsibility was to maintain Maat. And if he couldn't maintain Maat, then they called into question his deity. They called into question who he was. And so no wonder Pharaoh was annoyed and angered so greatly and became so bitter and was so hardened in his heart because his very authority, his very sovereignty was being called into question by the sovereign God of the universe. So I just thought that was an interesting addendum to include in our discussion today. Well, let's kind of review that final plague, the death of the firstborn. Exodus 12:29. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And this brings us to the next part of Hebrews chapter 11, referencing Moses and the children of Israel. Verse 29, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. So here's the account in Exodus 12, verse 37. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt. Now, let me just back up here real quickly. It says, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. Now, Sukkot and Ramses, we don't know exactly where those are, but we'll see them on a map here in just a moment. But we need to look at the numbers here as far as how many people left Israel. Now, a lot of skeptics, a lot of critics, they say, well, there was as few as like 5,000 Israelites. Some say 10, 15,000, but nowhere near what the Bible says. Now, it just seems silly to me. Well, of course, they don't believe any of the Bible, so why would they believe this particular account here? But Scripture says there's 600,000 men on foot. Now, that part where it says on foot, that's important because we're talking 600,000 men, but these are able-bodied men. So that means that there were more than 600,000 men, and there's not a number given for the women and children. Now, kind of a rule of thumb that I saw in one commentary is that if it says 600 able-bodied men, you can multiply that by 4, because they believe this is referring to those who were able to fight. And so that's not going to include, every male that is part of the population of Israel. And so they said multiply it by 4. Well, then you're coming up with 2.4 million. And most Bible scholars say that the children of Israel numbered between 2 million and 3 million. So 2.4 would fit in there just nicely. Because you can look at it this way. 600,000 men that we know for sure. Double that for the women, knowing that there were more women than men. And then you can kind of add double that figure, 1.2 million with the kids. But there's another phrase that I kind of glossed over the first time I read through this. It says in verse 38, a mixed multitude also went up with them. So what's the mixed multitude? Well, most scholars believe that this is referring to Egyptians or other foreigners that decided to follow the God of the Bible, the God of the Hebrews, or maybe they just wanted to get out of Egypt for whatever reason. So there were non-Israelites that were with them as well. So the 2.4 figure is very much in line with reason, and so just thought we should mention that very quickly. So remember, they had to leave hurriedly. Pharaoh's fed up with them, he wants them out, so they didn't have a chance to deal with baking bread and whatnot. And it says right there in verse 39, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So here's kind of the map there. You can see in the red circle, that is Goshen. And then Sukkot is just a little bit, not terribly far away, but still, it's a hike. And so let's continue in the account here. So it says in verse 40, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt, So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. And so that leads further credence to the idea that there were foreigners, there were non-Israelites that traveled with them out of Egypt. And then verse 50 and continuing in 51, all the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. I think chapter 12, verse 50 is a significant verse because we don't hear it often. All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. So we celebrate success when we can find it. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. Continuing in chapter 14, then the Lord said to Moses, Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of, and I wrote down the pronunciation because I struggle with it. It's Pihahiroth. So encamp in front of Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, They are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So they obeyed him again. Verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Now this is kind of there's an irony here, because when the children of Israel say, weren't there any graves available for us in Egypt? Keep in mind, the Egyptians were obsessed with death. And so there were no shortage of graves for anybody in Egypt. And so it's a very sarcastic statement that the children of Israel are making. Now notice Moses' response in verse 13. He says to the people, Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. So Moses gives amazing words of comfort and encouragement to the children of Israel. Now we have a little bit of a gap here, because in verse 15 it says, The Lord said to Moses, Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. So the implication is that after Moses gives this great speech to the children of Israel, then he goes to the Lord on his own and maybe shares some of the same fears and concerns. We don't know for sure. But the Lord's response is, why are you whining to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. So continuing in the end of verse 17, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Verse 19, then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Now, some scholars believe that the Egyptians stayed in darkness, that the cloud continued to keep them in the dark, literally and figuratively, and yet it was light on the other side where the children of Israel were. And you can imagine how, see, God wasn't done speaking to the Egyptians, and this is yet another declaration of war on the Egyptian gods, because when because basically God is attacking Ra, the sun god, once again, by keeping the Egyptians in the dark, not providing them the light. So then continuing in verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord, in the pillar of fire and cloud, looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. So pretty interesting, and we've all seen the movies and pictures of the chariots getting stuck in the mud, and these were the elite, those 600 were the best of the best of the Egyptian officers and leaders. Now some have asked, did Pharaoh die in this, in the Red Sea or not? And there's different opinions on this, but Scripture does say in chapter 14 verse 6, if you recall, that Pharaoh did take his chariot. So and this would have been consistent with Egyptian pharaohs to go into battle with the army. Now, whether he was consumed by the Red Sea, don't know 100% for sure, but that's a good possibility that he did. So verse 26, then Moses said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. So note once again, even though God tells Moses, hey, I want you to raise your staff and the waters are going to begin to come back onto the Egyptians, notice God still takes responsibility for the death of the Egyptians. It says the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. Verse 28, the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Now, if you've seen the movie The Prince of Egypt, one thing that I liked is that as they're walking through the water, you can see sea life, you can see animals. It's like their own personal aquarium. And why wouldn't God do that? Show his majesty, his might, and his creation in the midst of protecting them and guiding them. Verse 30, thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. how soon that would change. Now, where exactly is the Red Sea, and where exactly did they cross? Well, you can see the Red Sea over there, and we have the Gulf of Suez that is in the circle there, but the question is, where exactly did they cross? Now, some, especially skeptics, have said, well, because it's really called the Reed Sea, and reeds can't grow along the Red Sea because it's one of the saltiest bodies of water on the planet, it's probably one of these freshwater lakes that's up north, and that's what they crossed. Maybe, but I think God can do whatever he wants. So you can see a little bit of a close-up there. Now, there are some who believe that the Israelites crossed over there at the north end of the Gulf of Suez. But there are some, and there's pretty good arguments that they actually traveled down into this area and they crossed over here, the other Gulf, in the northern part of, this time in the northeastern part of the Red Sea. So do we know for sure? No. Now there's a really compelling movie. Part 1 came out in February, and I'm spacing on the name of it right now, but I have put it on order, and I'll give you information on that on the website, or excuse me, on the email that's sent out. Volume 2 is supposed to come out in May, but they ran into production problems. They're based in Minnesota, and they weren't able to finish the film when they thought they would be able to, and when they did get it finished because of the pandemic, they weren't able to show it in any theaters. So I looked at their website yesterday, and it said that, in fact, I signed up to find out when it'll be coming out, but I'm intrigued by it because the creator of this documentary looks at the possibility of the Israelites crossing at a different point than we have thought in the past. So why is it called the Red Sea? You can see from that photo, it's not red. In fact, it's a beautiful kind of turquoise color. But there's a few reasons that it could be called the Red Sea. Well, there's one of them. We mentioned red algae earlier, and the Red Sea does get these algae blooms similar to what we see here locally at Green Lake in Seattle, although they're not red. But you get these algae blooms that appear, and when the algae dies, there's a close-up of the algae. When it dies, then it gives off kind of a reddish brown dye or tinge to the water. Now, there's others that say, well, really the word there, it's the Sea of Reeds, or the Reed Sea. We just referenced that as far as why it probably isn't correct, because there aren't reeds that grow around the Red Sea. The other possibility is that in ancient times, the word red was associated with south, and the word black was associated with north. In fact, yellow and white were used for east and west. And so there is a Black Sea that is north, and the Red Sea being south. So that's another possibility as to why it's called the Red Sea. Now, there may be other possibilities, but those are the ones that I found, and I thought that was kind of interesting. So after the children of Israel cross the Red Sea, Moses sings a song, and I think it's awesome, and this is in Exodus chapter 15. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea, and his chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them, they went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury, it consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils the waters piled up, the floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness? awesome and glorious deeds, doing wonders. You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as a stone. Till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased, you will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established, the Lord will reign forever and ever. So it's an amazing song, and you can just picture the children of Israel singing this song, chanting these words, singing praises to God as they have been delivered from 430 years of slavery, and they've been delivered by the armies of the Egyptians. Verse 19, for when the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea. Then Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang a song, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. And I love Miriam's song because all we have, if that's it, it's just this one line here, this one verse, if you will. She didn't need a lot of words. She just very succinctly points out that we can sing to the Lord. He has triumphed over the Egyptians, and we can celebrate because of that. So what can we learn? Well, last week, this is what we put down as the three main points, and I think they're the same principles that we can learn from this, that God is all-powerful, He is everywhere, and He's all-knowing. But how does it apply to us? How should it impact our lives? It's one thing to acknowledge that God is powerful, but does it change how we think? Does it affect how we live? When I'm going through a crisis, do I remember the God who delivered the Israelites? Do I remember the God that overthrew the Egyptians, that parted the Red Sea? And how can we share this with other people? Share your story. You may not be a people person, you may not like talking to people, but how does your life point people to the God of the Bible? How does your life point people to Jesus? And lastly, a challenge. A question really, and I'd love to hear from you. What have you learned about God these last few months during the pandemic and during the social unrest that we see around us? What have you learned about God? What have you learned about yourself? What is God teaching you? There's so much that we can learn from God's Word and from these plagues. All of God's Word, as Paul tells Timothy, is important. It's God-breathed. It's inspired of Him, and that means that it is profitable for our instruction in righteousness. And God wants us to be men and women that know what they're talking about, that know why they believe what they believe. And so with that, let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer. Father God, thank you for your word and that it is reliable. God, thank you that you are reliable, that you are all-powerful, and that you will guide us through these challenging times, through these difficult times. We need not fear. You have already parted the Red Sea for us. All we need to do is to walk in faith, to keep our eyes on you, on that pillar of fire, that pillar of cloud that will guide us 24/7. God, thank you for loving us and for expressing that love ultimately through your Son, Jesus Christ, His death and His resurrection. We love you. We love Jesus. We thank you in His name. Amen. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great week. Bye.